Come with me to a magical place where being labeled the pork queen is a compliment, where being nice is just a way of life, and where all leaders of the free world must pass through. Welcome to Iowa. Whether you're a current Iowan, an Iowa expat, or an Iowan at heart, this show is for you. This is the Iowa Podcast. Real Iowans, real talk, no drama. I'm Justin Brady from the Brady Dental Care Studio, and joining me today is Joseph Nelson, the CEO of Roboflow here in Iowa, to discuss all the new AI regulations that were just signed by the president. Joseph, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So a lot to get into, and it obviously just happened. So this is, I'm sure a lot more will come out soon. But Roboflow, really quick disclosure, you guys were a client a while back. So obviously not a client now, but I want to get that in there. So for those that love the Iowa Podcast, every week we're bringing you really incredible information. We're bringing you great Iowa guests. And so make sure to subscribe, would you? Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeart. It's even on Amazon. So make sure to subscribe. All right, Joseph. So the first thing is obviously Roboflow is a pretty reputable company. You guys have gotten some investments from some, like, I would just call them celebrity venture capitalists. And in the tech world, you guys are a big deal. So let's just, for people who don't know you, let's just get that out there. But obviously, President Biden has signed executive order regulating AI and AI companies. And so I guess the big question is, are you and your team concerned about it at all?
Well, in general, the executive order was just signed yesterday, right? And the full 110-page document has just been released. And so pouring over the fact sheet and getting a sense of what's included, what's not included, is just as early for me as it is, I think, everyone. That said, I think the intentions are largely good. I think the administration's aiming to make the United States be a leader in investing in making AI be a core competency and capturing the upside of it while minimizing the downside. Now, in terms of the ways that I think regulatory has a history, or maybe lack thereof, of encouraging and enabling successful adoption of technology, I do have some skepticism and some concerns, especially as a smaller company. Regulation typically favors those that are incumbents, but I'm sure we can get into that. Overall, I think it's well intended, but it's also quite broad, and it's an executive order, so it's kind of to be determined how much of this can truly be implemented and enforced, and what exactly the specifics will be. I mean, when EOs like this are sort of passed, they're deliberately broad and generic, I think, to provide the opportunity for individual agencies to enforce and determine the best way to enforce, rather than extremely clear. And that's kind of the stage that we're at now, is there's broad-based terms, goals, and objectives, though not a ton yet of specifics of how those objectives will be borne out.
So you're hoping that this shapes AI regulation, and that this isn't like the final, say in it. You're hoping that it changes.
Well, I'm hoping that this invokes and instills and doubles down on investment on AI research in the US. I mean, a lot of parts of the executive order are about talent and investment in AI's upside potential for labor, for climate, a number of areas. There are also areas that the executive order calls for overwatch and validation, I would call it, of training of models. And I think some of those areas, while perhaps well-intended, may not accomplish their goals. But I think, taking the good with the bad, I think there are some areas here where the executive order is aiming to make it such that the U.S. is the place to do artificial intelligence.
Right. So, there was a really interesting tweet. One of my friends is in healthcare, and he's in AI in healthcare. And he posted director Arati Prabhakar, and I could be getting that name wrong, but he posted her comments, and essentially, let's see, what was the quote here? Okay, so basically, what his quote? This is his quote. So he's in medical healthcare, and he says that he's commenting on her comments. Okay, so he says comparing Gutenberg's printing press to AI, and in the same breath celebrating the regulation of it, is just like what the European monarchs did in 1468. So to your point, he's saying, you know, she's talking about how Gutenberg was this great technology and it should be celebrated, and AI is a great technology, but it could be used for bad, which is why we're regulating it. Like, this is essentially his argument is, this was the same argument leveled at the printing press, why we should burn books and regulate writings. Do you see the same comparison, or is it not quite a fair comparison?
I think it's far-reaching to make that comparison so far. I mean, I think skepticism is warranted. Like, there's pretty high-level, flowery language that would be tough for any one person to say, oh, yeah, that's something that we shouldn't do. For example, like, oh, we should capture the upside benefits. We should protect against risks. We should better protect privacy. We should evaluate how there's clear and fair standards. We should eliminate algorithmic bias. We should enable AI to be used responsibly. These are all noble goals and objectives that I think it's pretty difficult for anyone to disagree with, right? It's kind of like if the executive order, pretend we're not talking about AI, pretend the executive passes an executive order that's like, we should foster economic growth. Very few folks are going to be like, oh yeah, that's not something that we should invest in and have happening. The devil's going to be in the details of how one thinks we should go about fostering that growth, right? Like, if you're generally a Democratic Party, fostering economic growth is going to look different than if you're generally a Republican Party. And I think the same is true here for the executive order as it relates to AI. It's like, yes, it's very difficult to say, no, I don't, to disagree or not support advancing responsible use of AI. But if you said what the way that manifests, and this is TBD, but just an example, one way you could argue that responsible use of AI manifests is you could say the only way that artificial intelligence could be used in your product is if you pass a series of lengthy tests, and those tests could only be borne, the costs of enduring those tests could only be borne out by companies that are much larger scale. Like, for example,
that's a good point.
So for example, like, you know, the FDA in healthcare is known to be one place where there should be a strong regulatory regimen for the purposes of protecting citizen health, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you and I both want to ensure the medicine that we take are safe, tested, and validated. That said, I think if you talked with a number of healthcare experts, the multi-phase, multi-year waiting period does stifle many good drugs making their way to market more quickly. And you know, there's some balance between the regulatory regime that exists presently for bringing drugs to market and one that might be most optimal for enabling innovative drugs to be brought to market. And I think that for AI, you could see a similar standpoint, right? Like, think about it from the perspective of a young organization and a young startup. In the context of healthcare, if you don't have 5, sometimes 10 years of runway, like Moderna was a publicly traded company before they released their first product to consumers, right? And
wow,
if you're not a well-funded company and you have that sort of regulatory burden before you're enabled to bring your product to market, that actually may not advance the use of responsible use of AI. It actually might stifle our ability to know how AI should be used responsibly at all. Now, I'm not suggesting and making an equivalence of saying this EO calls for an equivalent amount of regulation of bringing healthcare or bringing drugs to market. I'm more just trying to draw the parallel that when we say we want responsible use of AI, one way that could be construed is limiting innovation and understanding of incredibly powerful technology. And because AI, you know, we're in the very early innings in a very exciting way of all the ways that artificial intelligence is going to improve what it means to be, you know, frankly, even like human existence. Basically, there's no part of society or humanity's history where adding intelligence to a system reduces the quality of that system. And that's what AI is. It's adding intelligence to a system and decreasing the cost of intelligence. So whether that's, you know, fighting climate change, improving regulatory, finding new drugs, enabling us to like move goods more efficiently. Like all of these areas are going to be radically improved with AI. And I think the more that we introduce potential unintentional burden to finding and adopting and revolutionizing our economy with all the ways AI will be impactful, the actually the more we're living in the upside of the potential. So that's the thing I worry about with an executive order like this is well-intended and broad-reaching language with unintentional implementation,
right?
That undermines the results it's aiming to foster.
Yeah, and you're not alone in that concern. A lot of people are wondering if this is a backdoor to regulatory capture, and a lot of bigger companies are saying. Because this isn't, you're not the first to bring this up, right? Which is that large companies can get through the FDA process. Small companies and small innovators that may very well have the next gen solution cannot get through the FDA. And so you can make the safety argument, right? We don't want crazy street drugs treating everyone for certain diseases. Obviously, nobody wants that. But at the same time, even like yourself, you guys are a very small startup and you were disrupting a lot of what bigger companies could do. And, I could see why a big company would want to go to their congressman and say, hey, these little guys aren't regulated. They're not very safe. You should have extremely long and expensive processes to get, to slow down that runway for these small guys. So to your point, in this executive order, the Department of Health and Human Services has been tasked to create a program to evaluate potentially harmful AI-related healthcare practices. So what you said earlier, like who's actually creating intentionally harmful AI-related healthcare practices, and who defines what harmful really is?
Not only that, but I think who determines what falls into scope and out of scope for a given use case. And I think that there's a strong history of introducing regulators ever increasing the things that they're able to regulate in a sense. Yeah. Like if you have the opportunity to oversee something, then of course you're going to view it as your right and responsibility to oversee those things. And so I think that, for example, let's talk about healthcare. Like if we're talking about drug discovery, it's like, yes, that's very probably clearly up the fairway. But like, maybe if we're talking about healthcare and we're saying it's in the context of we have users that will use our products, for example, for doing content moderation and validating or invalidating whether there's a presence of, we'll say like in some content like drugs or alcohol or things like this. Or maybe you make a claim that this is something similar to, you could make a claim that that's similar to mental health care or consumption of products that are not healthy and all these sorts of things. I mean, I guess my point is I have a healthy sense of skepticism of what's in the air bounds and what isn't. And by the way, this isn't just like a self-interested, like, oh, okay, like you're one company, of course you want to enable AI to be used. It's much bigger than like small company, big company. This is like the way innovation happens. There's just so much to explore with artificial intelligence and machine learning that, it's the most powerful technology of our lifetimes. And I think that's what society is coming to realize and agree. Now, with that in mind, like, Andrew Ng's famous for saying AI is the new electricity. Imagine if only a subset of companies, of the 4 biggest companies of the era, are able to say and experiment and see you can use electricity for. The amount of ways that we would have limited consumer electronic growth and exploration. And it's just simply like, you can make it as simple as the following. There are more people outside of, the big 3 tech companies than there are inside of the big 3 tech companies. No matter how big they are.
Right. Correct.
There's more people outside than inside. And given that, there's more innovation and responsible development and exploration that can be taken place that fosters innovation and fosters things like cheaper drug discovery, better ways of solving cancer. Like if you're a startup that's trying to spin out of a university lab because you think you found an innovative way to tackle a form of novel cancer, in a world where you need to abide by a series and set of regulations, maybe you don't do that. Maybe that future doesn't exist.
Right.
And so I think what I'm suggesting is that we're very early in a positive way, and we should be looking at that with optimism for all the ways that we know AI and ML is going to improve and shape the way that we live.
Yeah. And like to your point, one of my clients, because people on the podcast, this is my Iowa podcast, but people know that I do other stuff, right? This isn't my full-time job. So to your point, there's another client I had that had a amazing medical device, FDA cleared, really cool device, very small company in Iowa. I might actually have them on in the future. But they had this new device sitting. It's non-invasive, non-drug, and they had a new device sitting on this table. And I was like, man, that's really cool. Why don't you guys push that out to the market? Like, let's do it. And he's like, Justin, we'd love to, but we don't have like the few million to clear that through the FDA. I'm like, are you insane? And he was like, yeah, all the testing we need to do. He goes, that's understood. We should do that. You should do safety testing, but we have to do all this reporting. We have to do the regulatory process. We have to wait a long time, sometimes years, and we just don't have the runway to do that. So there was this amazing life-saving technology sitting on a shelf. They were just not going to push out to commercialization because they didn't have the capital to do it. And I'm like, how many amazing tech innovators are out there that could solve a disease or solve a big problem, but they can't because in some cases, I'm not saying all, but in some cases, the regulation is prohibiting them from doing so. So like, I want to get, and obviously you're not a lawyer, but like what exactly are regulations here intending to do? Because if I build a new product and I 3D print some new, widget that no one has ever seen before, and I go smack someone over the head with it and they die, no one's going to come and say, well, there are no regulations around that widget he made, so therefore we don't really know if he killed that person. They're just going to say, you built a tool. I don't really care what the tool is, but you obviously intended to kill that person and you did so, therefore you're going to go to jail, right? So don't current laws on the books actually protect civil liberties? Don't they actually, don't they already achieve most of what this bill's trying to achieve? Or are there some actual areas that this executive order is pushing into that current laws just simply did not account for?
What you're getting at with your example is, I think, extremely shrewd. And that is, regulation that's targeted at a use case rather than a technology is more likely to be successful in protecting public interest. So for example, there's a number of regulations on the books today that prevent discrimination in the process of applying for and receiving housing. And this is a good example to bring up because the executive order calls out algorithms that maybe approve or deny decisions for receiving housing as a specific example of AI. And I think that the way to regulate something like this is to continue to lean into presently the outcome, the outcome of there should not be unfair preferential treatment for someone based on a set number of standards is how we know if a system is fair or not. It's not whether or not the technology uses AI. It's whether the outcome results in equitable treatment of all that are participating in the system. And you take that same form of thinking to your 3D printer example. It's not whether or not someone used a 3D printer. It's what they used the outcome of that 3D printer for. Or we look at AI in the context of, again, in the context of healthcare. It's not that AI inherently being used for drug discovery is good or bad. It's, well, you shouldn't be producing and creating things that intentionally introduce harm. And as you mentioned, there's of course already a number of ways by which we can say, hey, you had a harmful intent that shouldn't be allowed. And so I think that this is the great thing to call out is that I think a skeptic would say that the executive order is a response to other countries, especially the United Kingdom and countries across Europe and certainly the EU, wanting to quote unquote take the lead in regulation. And to me, it's kind of funny to say you want to be the leader in regulation globally. I think that this executive order is aiming to for the Biden administration, I think they I think the Biden administration views being the global leader on AI regulation as an important place to lead. And so I think that this executive order is basically being able to enter the administration into that conversation. But in doing so, it basically, you net out with, great, let's talk about a what instead of a, the why, or, the actual use case by use case. Like, maybe we can use another parallel, right? Databases are an incredibly transformative technology when they came out, and Oracle and MySQL and some of these things revolutionizing the way that we're able to access, store, and query data, and fundamentally changed how software could be built. And if I said to you, Justin, hey, there's a new technology coming online that allows me to store every single thing, every single record of a place that you've been or a document you've written, and access and retrieve that record in sub-second latency for the purposes of making decisions or applications about something you're going to do, you could say, oh, wow, that technology, that sounds way too powerful. Like, those databases, those right. need to be banned or regulated or better understood. And that's kind of what's happening here to some degree, when in reality, what should be done is, well, how are you using that database? What information are you, the information that you're storing, you're using it to what ends? And that's the same thing for AI, right? The age old, you don't regulate the use of a hammer, you like the existence of a hammer, you regulate how to use a hammer. AI is an extremely powerful tool that's a new form of intelligence. But at the end of the day, it is still a tool that we can wield.
Right.
And so we should be thinking through it in the lens of, how do I wield this capability? Not the fact that the capability exists in of itself.
Yeah.
And let me get one more specific thing about databases to AI if present. The way that regulators have been talking about regulating AI in terms of its capability has been in terms of model size and parameters, which is extremely misguided. So the way that model intelligence is often measured is by its capability, and its capability is, yes, indeed, typically correlated with the size and number of parameters of that model. Parameters meaning how many things basically it takes into account when making a decision. So if you take more things into account, it follows that you might be more capable of a technique. Well, doing something there's been some suggestions that a good way to regulate AI is, if you're a model above some parameter count, then you need to start reporting on results to the government. Or if you're using compute above some threshold, then you need to start reporting to the government. This is exactly the type of regulation that is somewhat equivalent to regulating by counting numbers of lines of code. Like if your application,
that's a good point.
If your software application exceeds X number of lines of code, then you need to start talking to the government. And as you and I talk about that, hopefully that becomes abundantly clear that it's not really about the number of lines of code or the efficiency of your code. It's more about, what is that code doing and for whom and to what end? Because you could use a big model for relatively benign purposes, or you could use a big model for relatively harmful purposes. But the model size itself isn't really the relevant portion of that. It's how are you using the model? And that's where regulation can be, and perhaps already is, targeted. So ultimately, I think focusing on, the fact that you say AI means that you need to go through a new set of standards ends up being misplaced, versus how are you using AI, and is that a place where there's either existing laws that protect the equitable and fair and just treatment of people, or is there a new place that we need to investigate to ensure that we live in a society that is right and just?
Right, because this can set a precedent that, everything capable of hurting another individual should be regulated. And if I can define what is potentially harmful, I can regulate pretty much everything. Even I would imagine I could regulate paper. paper factories and paper mills, because if someone is motionless and I have a stack of paper, I could technically paper cut them enough that, death by 1,000 cuts. Therefore, we should regulate the paper companies. So that is, obviously the concern is that, no, we have laws that regulate intent and action. We don't need to regulate every little tool. Now, I know there are good reasons to regulate certain tools, but, it creates kind of a bizarre precedent where we need to regulate every little thing that could potentially harm someone. And to your point, the Biden order looks like it mandates companies share safety testing results with the U.S. government before they release any official AI systems. And so, if you're sharing all your data and results with the government, two things are a concern. One, who's being influenced to influence these test results? Are they going to want certain AI tools coming online? That's obviously a concern. But the other one is obviously cost as well. And the other one is what really defines harmful. That's still, I don't see that anywhere in the bill. So one of the concerns is you mentioned earlier about other countries looking at regulating AI and how maybe the Biden White House wanted to kind of set precedent and they wanted to be the first to do this. If regulations do get a little too heavy-handed over in the United States, let's just paint that picture. Like, what if it gets too heavy-handed? What if these regulations kind of bog down innovation? What's stopping you or your co-founders or your company from simply outsourcing your development or your AI work to another country?
I think that's one potential downside risk is you're not able to capture and attract innovators. I honestly think the greater risk, though, is the United States should want to be the preeminent place where artificial intelligence advances are occurring, right? If you believe that AI and machine learning is the most formative technology of our lifetimes, or even one of, let's not take the most, let's just say one of, then you should also want the United States to be leading the way in exploring, identifying, and enabling those advances to have a positive influence in the world. Let me paint kind of an alternative.
Sure.
ChatGPT and OpenAI, of course, are based in the US and showcase, we kind of had some folks describe it like the ChatGPT moment earlier this year when it became broadly accessible and aware of how intelligent and capable models are getting. And one, I think, filled with excitement. Now, imagine a world where ChatGPT didn't come out of the US. Imagine a world where it came out of another country, where that country published the next best gen model. And you can envision a world where that model maybe came from a country that, okay, we'll say maybe it's a country that's more generally values aligned with the US, and that's maybe less concerning. Imagine a world where countries that are generally more adversarial with the US published it. Like, imagine a world where Russia published the next ChatGPT or China published the next ChatGPT. And I think that if you consider these worlds, what you realize is you actually contain a lot of subtle influence in terms of how new technology gets adopted and what that technology is frankly allowed and capable of doing. And if you think of a country like the United States, we generally have a system of far more openness and awareness and freedom of expression. And if you envision a world where ChatGPT, which already has some folks call it safeguards, but some ways of encouraging or discouraging some types of discussion. If you imagine a world where a country that didn't support the same level of free speech released a model like this, I mean, and you believe that something like ChatGPT is going to be one of the future ways that we understand knowledge and it influences education and the ability for folks to learn. I mean, I'm talking to friends who their kids will regularly, in a very fun way, chat with ChatGPT and as almost an alternative to Wikipedia to learn and digest subjects, right? So it's not that far of a leap to believe that ChatGPT influences thinking
for sure.
and education and these sorts of things. So if you envision a world where the US isn't the leader in putting out models like this, and in fact, it's perhaps places that don't share a similar set of values that we prize and maintain, I think that is actually the greater threat than innovators fleeing for elsewhere.
No,
this technology is so important that I think that it carries a lot of soft power, right? Of, it's like the same reason, like, how do you quantify the value of Hollywood being as influential as it is globally, and it being, cool to wear blue jeans and these sorts of things. Like, I think that large models actually carry a lot of similar soft power of what's cool and how to understand and how someone comes to learn about the world.
And if we overregulate or don't do this right, then we're going to get past. I can tell you right now, the Chinese probably are not going to regulate AI the same way we will, or those in India or people in Singapore. They're not going to regulate it the same way, right? And so the countries who have more favorable regulations and don't really have tons of hoops to draw through, or excuse me, tons of hoops to jump through, will probably get their share of innovators. And, because if AI is really the next electricity, I believe you're right, just because I've talked to people like you and a lot of other intelligent people that are in the developer space. But if AI really is the next electricity, and we're saying, yeah, we're going to really regulate heavily who can use it in the United States, we will get past. So Joseph Nelson, CEO of Roboflow, who you guys have everything you need to build and deploy computer vision models. Because I've worked with you in the past, I know how mind-blowingly amazing it is. For those that don't know, I always say it like this. I feel like you guys give the sense of sight to software and computers. So it's really cool stuff. What's the website, and how do people get in touch with you if they want to learn more?
We're at roboflow.com, and I'm Joseph.Nelson at roboflow.com. Thanks so much for the discussion today, Justin.
Absolutely pleasure to have you. And to my fellow Iowans, Iowa expats, and Iowans at heart, thanks for listening and subscribing to the Iowa Podcast.